Hey everyone, this is lecture 1.2, and here we're talking about what exactly is this thing, environmental justice. The last one's title wasn't maybe that great and maybe indicated that was where I was telling you what the course is about. This one's actually where we're doing it. So we're going to talk about how science works in general, what exactly is social science, and how does that apply to the environment. In terms of content warnings, I'm going to allude to the fact that maybe some of your teachers in the past have been not 100% accurate, and that wasn't their fault. My 5th grade teacher probably didn't mean to lie to me, but she definitely added to some misconceptions I had, and probably some misconceptions you have as well. That's okay. No one meant bad. Racism. It's something we're going to talk about. We're also going to talk about religion and politics a little bit, poverty, and asthma. All of those things are mainly in regard to things that we study, right? So it's going to be in the broadest sense, so nothing too horrible. So it's likely that you've been learning about science, or at least what you thought was science, since your early childhood. And that's great. So I love it that preschool teachers talk about science, and I love it that kindergarten kids and first graders and all the little ones are talking about science, and then people in high school are talking about science. It's amazing. But it usually, a side effect of teaching science to little kids is that they often miss some of the very basic premises of what it means for something to be science. So we wind up learning, most of us, that science is very good, that scientists are often right, and scientists are very smart. Well, that's not even how we want you to think of scientists, really, right? What makes sociology a science but does not make history a science, right? I'm sure my big kid right now wouldn't be able to tell you, because that's just not really what they think about. Moving on, and I could really pick apart like elementary school science projects, but I'm not going to do that right now. If you have me for an in-person class, I'm sure I'll talk about it. So by asking questions and answering those questions on observable reality, that's how we do science, right? If we can see something, if we can look at it, or if we can do that with our tools, we can eventually figure it out, right? That's the really cool thing about science. Unfortunately, there are some things that we wonder about and that we observe and we see and we notice that we don't necessarily see with our eyes. Well, those are harder, right? We can't prove like the meaning of the universe, right? But what we can prove is the age of at least the things around us, right? And we can find the oldest thing, or the oldest thing we can see in space, and then from that make sense of, well, how old is everything, right? So those are big ideas too. They're just not the big why am I here ideas. And what allows us to see those things is the scientific method. Scientific method is just a series of steps to make sure we're doing science right. I wish it was called the scientific procedure, but it's not. It's called the scientific method. You maybe learned exactly this set of words to learn about the scientific method, but your high school chemistry teacher probably didn't point out that different people have different like wordings of this thing. I've seen it as 5 steps. I've seen it as 7 steps, 10 steps, 20 steps. As long as the same stuff is happening, though, it's still science. Really, the most central to those are the research, what we often call research, the reading about the topic, the hypothesis, the experiment and collecting data, and then the conclusions we come to based on that stuff. Now, I will also point out that the word research on this graphic isn't what I want it to be. The word research in science means information you've collected yourself and figured out yourself. So if you read about it in an encyclopedia or online or whatever, you're not doing research, you are learning about stuff that's happened in the past. Now, if you were to go out and conduct a survey of human beings and take in what they tell you and then compile that and analyze that data, that then is scientific research. It sounds like a minor point, but the reality of the matter is, with so many people backing up online conspiracy theories saying things like, well, you have to do your own research, most of those people don't actually understand what scientific research is, so thus problems arise. I'll just kind of leave it there. And there are times when I can rant on this for hours. I'm not going to, because we're online and things are supposed to be brief. Okay. So there's another area where we kind of fail our kids in terms of scientific literacy. We usually think of the physical sciences when we think of science. So things like chemistry, biology, geology, entomology. I say entomology just because I love talking about the study of bugs. All of those things, for sure. Those are science, 100%. Why are they science? Because they use the scientific method. That's what makes it science. But then also, social sciences are also science, right? Just the same. They are. Physics is not more science than sociology is. They are just studying different things. So sociology is a social science, anthropology, psychology. Physiology is arguably a physical science. Economics, linguistics, all of these things are social sciences because they use the scientific method of testing hypotheses, etc. Now, what kind of science is sociology? Well, we study human social interaction, right? A lot of times people get confused between psychology and sociology. Psychologists generally study what's happening in one person's mind, while sociologists study what's happening in groups of people. So it's psychology, one person, sociology, two or more, basically is the easy way to break that down. So just to break it out a little bit differently, climatology is a science. Just because they didn't teach it in your high school doesn't mean it's not a science. Psychology is a science, physics is a science, linguistics is a science. Comparative studies usually are not science. Sometimes they are, but they don't have to be comparative studies. So it's one of those weird areas that falls between. Poetry. Poets aren't scientists. That doesn't mean poets are bad. That doesn't mean that poetry isn't beautiful, that poetry isn't meaningful, that poetry doesn't add to our human experience, but it's not science because it doesn't use the scientific method. Religion, similarly. Religion helps a lot of people live their lives in ways that are meaningful for them, and the things that they believe help them get them through the world and maybe beyond, right? That's great for them. It's not science, though. They're not doing the scientific method. There have actually been religions that have tried to do that, but that is a very different, weird story all on its own. History. The discipline of history is methodical. It is incredibly careful, and there's so much to learn in history. But they have their own methods to doing things that aren't scientific, and that's okay, and that's great. Most of philosophy is not scientific. There's a few little areas that can be. Politics and political maneuvering in the world sometimes can pull on scientific ideas, but doing it in and of itself is not. So just because something is not a science, what am I pointing out here, doesn't mean it's not great, right? I wouldn't want all literature to be scientific. It'd probably be really super boring, right? So science is Good for figuring out the observable world. That is what science is for. Science is probably not going to be able to tell you if you should get married, right? Or how to feel when your parents die, or what to name your kid, right? Those are other things that we have to deal with that are in the world that aren't really science. But what science does is amazing. And what those other things do are also amazing. That's the gist of this. Please don't call art. Please don't say when you're working on an art project, well, it's art, but it's also kind of science. No, it's not. It's art. Please just do your art. Thank you. Anyway, it's a personal thing. Unfortunately, sometimes people don't understand social scientific findings. And just like they can use scientific findings to back up phony baloney political ideas, they can also use social scientific ideas to do that too. And unfortunately, this data has been used often to fuel politics. And there's a picture of Ted Cruz up there, definitely a politician who has used science incorrectly, and he is a Republican, but Democrats have also absolutely done it as well. Cruz just happens to use charts badly too, so that's why he's my victim here. My personal opinion, and this is the first opinion I've given you, is that, okay, fine. It is politicians. I can be cool with a politician if they are going to use scientific data to back up their argument. Actually, that's pretty neat if they do that. But if they leave information out, and if they manipulate that information to do what they want to do, that's not okay. Because you know what that isn't? That is not science. That's the opposite of science. It's anti-intellectual. It's anti-democracy. So there is my first soapbox. Yeah. So as a sociology course, the concepts presented here are based on scientific data, right? And I was very upfront. This is based on my opinion, right? The stuff I'm presenting to you is based on scientific data and scientific information. It is not just a collection of opinions. It truly isn't. I make a lot of effort to not just give you all my opinions, right, and spew them at you, because that's not okay either. Some of these concepts can be debated, others can't. We don't do that as much in an online class as we would in an in-person class, but something like, what should we do about poverty in our country? You can debate that. What you can't debate is, are there poor people in Powell or Bexley or any rich area you think of as being rich, or New Albany? And yeah, those are all Central Ohio places, but wherever you are, you can think of the rich people places. And in almost all of those rich people places, unless they are physically keeping poor people out, like with gates and stuff, there are poor people in every community in the United States. That is a fact. My wife is a social worker, and she heads up a social work organization. And one of the things that really she has to deal with almost every day is people claiming, well, there's no poor people in our neighborhood. There are poor people in every neighborhood, and those poor people need help just as much as everyone else does. So how do we apply this then to climate change? Well, as a discipline, sociology is intensely broad, because as a discipline, we study human behavior, and humans do a whole bunch of things, right? So almost anything we do in society can be studied sociologically. We can study university classrooms, we can study people who are in prison, we can study strip clubs. Some of those things make us feel more or less comfortable than others, but all of them can be something that you can study using social science. Environmental sociologists then study how climate change impacts human behavior and how different groups are impacted by environmental hazards in different ways, right? So what would we study? can study something like asthma. Asthma is much more common among African American children than children of other groups. And if you maybe don't know much about human biology, there truly is very little difference about the way human bodies operate based on race, right? And everything that we see as being the differences, those are truly, and we have shown this over and over again, cosmetic, right? Black people's lungs don't work different than white people or any other group's lungs. All of our lungs work the same. So there's no reason why, for a biological reason, that African Americans should be having asthma at different rates than white people. But the reality is that because black people are disproportionately poor, and they are disproportionately poor because of social structures in our society that have kept them poor since their ancestors were in slavery, then those people live in areas that tend to be closer to industrial areas and polluting areas, and those kids that grow up in those areas tend to get asthma. Now, within one neighborhood, if there is a black kid and a white kid that grow up in the same neighborhood, those two kids are equally likely to get asthma. That's really the gist of a lot of that. And that premise and that finding is one of the very first pieces of environmental sociology. That's kind of where the subdiscipline of environmental sociology and environmental justice then came from. So C. Wright Mills, you might be familiar with, early pivotal sociologist. He observed that we have to consider how history, how the story of all of society interacts with our individual history or our biography, right? He calls that the sociological imagination, in thinking about how the big picture interacts with us on the small level and vice versa. An environmental sociologist takes that model of history and biography and then says, absolutely, but we also have to include ecology, right? So we include the big picture of society, we include how those big picture social structures can be polluting, and then how that pollution can affect us on an individual level. And then also how the individual can cause pollution, how the individual can cause interaction with the big society as well. So it really is a case where you could draw like a triangle or three circles in a Venn diagram and how those things interact with each other. That's a good representation of what environmental sociology does. Oops. Oh. Please look at the previous slide. I'm going to try to remember what it said because my presentation won't let me go back one. The previous slide talks about nuclear waste, nuclear energy, etc. Nuclear energy can be used to create tremendous amounts of power in a very clean way, and that's super cool, actually. Unfortunately, human beings are dumb, and nuclear power can provide almost unlimited energy. Almost. Not unlimited, but almost unlimited energy. But unfortunately, people fall asleep at work, and people get drunk on the job, and sometimes people have sex with other people in closets when they're supposed to be working. And all of those things, because people work in those places, can also happen in a nuclear power plant, right? So this is an opinion, my perspective is that until we can really make humans perfect or make robots that can think completely on their own, nuclear power is a lot of trouble. But with that said, there's a lot of potential there too. Okay. And then another thing that's on that slide that I'm remembering, nuclear power plants tend to be located in facilities where poor people also are, right? And alluding to this slide too, this slide here is basically giving more information surrounding black kids being more likely to develop asthma than white kids. So that I talked about that a moment ago, and that's usually poor urban people, right? Well, because black people are more likely to live in cities than they are to live in country areas, and because country areas are usually predominantly white, and they're also predominantly, there's more poor people. There's also poverty in the countryside, right? So those areas that have nuclear power plants are usually in rural areas, and they tend to get located in places where rich people aren't, because rich people, surprisingly, don't want to live near nuclear power plants, because no one wants to live near a nuclear power plant, but poor people don't have a choice because they don't have money. So poor people are more likely then to be victims of radioactive contamination than rich people in rural areas. So it goes both ways. This kind of what we call environmental racism, and in the second example would be called environmental classism, exists all over the place. And that's what environmental sociologists study. And then one last example, more hopeful example, because I do try to sprinkle hope in this class. If we're going to cope with climate change, we're going to have to change the way we live on a large scale. So we can think about these big ideas. How will cities change to be more sustainable? Most cities, I won't even say all, but many cities, probably most cities, are thinking about now, how are we going to deal with climate change? And I sure hope they are. I know for a fact City of Columbus is, because my wife's working with some of those elements. Columbus is thinking about how is it going to be more sustainable? How are we going to deal with immigration patterns that are going to be impacted by raising sea levels, right? Because not only will cities be flooding on the coasts, but those people, most of them are going to get away, thank goodness, but they're going to have to go somewhere else, right? So when the coast floods, people are going to move in, which means probably that Columbus in central Ohio, which is not going to get flooded by the ocean, we're probably going to see a dramatic increase in our population because of people who will have to flee places like Miami and New York, maybe Philadelphia, coastal cities that they're maybe not the whole city, but at least where they lived isn't habitable anymore. And which countries are best equipped to deal with climate change? Which countries are going to be most devastated by climate change? How are those countries that are better off going to help those who are worse off? These are also things that we want to study. So one of the really neat things about environmental sociology is that we aren't just studying things in the past and the present. We're actually trying to predict things that might occur in the future, so that we can try to make things better than they would be if we hadn't anticipated it. And this is all super duper important, and it is all tremendously valuable. So that's the end of this lecture then, and I'll see you next time, or you'll listen to me next time, or however the heck it is I want to sign off. See you later.